Welcome, today's story is full of drama. Like and subscribe to stay updated. Let's get started.
It was just before our 8th anniversary when my first marriage began to unravel, though neither of us realized it at the time, at least not fully. Laura and I had married after a long courtship and engagement. Looking back, I have to say she never seemed particularly eager to marry, at least not to marry me. But at 28, she felt the pressure of time, worried about being seen as a spinster, while I was still just 26. With hindsight, I think she struggled with feelings of inadequacy, believing she had to hold on to the first man who didn't walk away. That man happened to be me, though I suspect her self-perception was skewed. She wasn't unattractive, perhaps not conventionally beautiful, but certainly not someone who should have felt unworthy. In time, I came to understand the root of her insecurities. Her father was a harsh, verbally abusive man, and her mother never stood up to him, never shielded their only child from his cruel words. As an aside, I think her father respected me in his own way. The first time we met, he tried his usual intimidation tactics. I shut him down and walked out. The next time, his attitude had noticeably changed. Eventually, we married and settled into something resembling a home life. Our wedding night was difficult, to say the least. Laura was unprepared for the experience, and it was painful for her. It took days before we tried again, and though things improved slightly over time, she never truly found joy in intimacy. We were substantially older than most first-time newlyweds and more responsible, so we were relatively flush with cash. Our student loans had been paid off, we owned our cars, and neither of us had fallen into the credit card trap. We had the money to afford a house outright, and we jumped at the opportunity to move into a new development in Greystone shortly after the wedding. We were never blessed with children. She became pregnant 3 times, and each spontaneously aborted within the first trimester. I wonder now, years later, whether things might have been sweeter for her had she been able to deliver a child. Sex became an issue. She tolerated it, mostly to placate me, but was never willing or perhaps able to abandon herself to my attempts to induce pleasure. Her most common bedroom phrase, uttered only when I attempted to initiate lovemaking, was, "How about just a quickie?" Many men would have enjoyed a setup like that. Most, I think, would eventually grow weary of such pro forma intimacy. I certainly did, mostly because I really, truly loved Laura and I wanted her to want me. I finally accepted such would never be the case. Our relationship reduced to a simmer. We both worked and enjoyed some of life's finer things and, for the most part, kept a respectable distance. And life went on. I don't want to give the impression life was all sour. There were plenty of good times. Our neighbors to the left, David and Patricia Reynolds, were perhaps our best friends. They were significantly older, early 50s when we moved in next to them, but we developed an over-the-fence relationship quickly. They made us part of their extended family, cookouts and picnics, card games and birthday parties, and 4th of July celebrations. A family to love and nurture and stand in for the ones we did not have. Work was good as well. Laura and I worked our respective ways up our respective corporate ladders. If money had never been an issue, it wasn't even on the radar by this point. Conservative as we were, never prone to excesses, we failed to indulge in new cars and furniture. Things like that. Our savings were substantial. The prospect of early retirement came up even as we were only in our early 30s. We even discussed setting a goal of retirement by age 46. Life took a few turns, though. One evening, I had to stop by the pharmacy on the way home, and so arrived a little later than usual. I knew from the sight of the ambulance in the Reynolds driveway that all was not well. Laura was standing on our front stoop, weeping. David had a heart attack. She told me as best she could. The paramedics had just gotten there before I arrived, and it didn't look good. We watched the ambulance pull away, and there was Patricia, trying to get into her car to follow, looking dazed and having trouble with the keys. Laura called to her. We bundled her into my car, and the 3 of us drove as quickly and safely as possible to the hospital. David was gone before we arrived. The next weeks and months were difficult, mostly for Patricia, but of course for us as well. We offered assistance, and stoic as she was, she accepted. None of your typical "I'm fine on my own" from that lady, let me tell you. Still, all the help we could give, all the love and support the neighborhood offered, were ultimately not enough. Patricia succumbed to the call of her oldest son to come and live with his family. He and his wife had 4 young children and lived not too far away. And so it was with great trepidation that we watched the moving van pull up to the house we still thought of as the Reynolds and the moving men transferring the contents into the house. Trepidation because the Reynolds were a known quantity. The new neighbors were a mystery yet to be unraveled. The new neighbor turned out to be a single woman about our age, a young widow, it turned out, named Melanie. She was attractive but unglamorous. Polite, if a bit cool, though we wrote that off to being uncomfortable around new neighbors. Eventually, of course, we began to get to know her. She was quite nice but maintained a remoteness David and Patricia had never evidenced. I remember the evening it all started. Our 8th anniversary was approaching. It was March, unseasonably cool and just right for leaving the windows open. Laura and I had not made love in quite a while, several weeks, in fact, and I thought I was due. As soon as I brought up the subject, I wished I had not. Sex, 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 she grumbled. That's all you ever think about. No, I shot back. You have it backwards. All I ever do about sex is think. I'm sure as hell not getting any. She threw down the magazine she'd been reading. When will you grow up? She barked. You're not 18 anymore. You don't need sex every day. Married people make love, Laura, I said more calmly than I felt. I can't help it. I'm reasonably young and I have a libido. I'm married to a desirable woman. This is not just me brooding. This is natural. Living the way we do is unnatural. We went back and forth on the subject, trading a few more barbs. Finally, Shed had enough. She spat and stormed out of the room. She locked herself in the guest room. I stood there for a moment, feeling simultaneously frustrated and confused. I didn't know how to solve the problem. Maybe I thought there was no solution. No viable solution anyway. I went to bed alone that night. Sleep was a long time coming. The next morning I awoke a little later than normal, but by no means had I overslept. My normal habit is to hit the treadmill for a brief workout prior to my morning ablutions. It would have to take a rest today. I realized soon enough. Laura had gone to work early. She had left me no note of acknowledgement, apology, or anything else. I sat at the table, fuming, trying to get my head into the day when it occurred to me. I had tons of personal time built up and absolutely nothing pressing on the calendar for that day. I called Ben, my boss. He was always an early riser and allowed how I had some things to tend to, household items that had piled up and simply needed attention. He told me I needed to take time off and gave me his blessing to play hooky. I think he suspected something, but he never let on. My date with the treadmill was back on. 15 minutes of steady plodding turned into 30 minutes of pushing myself forward, and that into 45 minutes of motion. All told, including a little jogging and some cooling down, it felt good to release some of my pent-up tension. I was nasty and in need of a shower in the worst way. Then I realized there really were things around the house I needed to do, starting with tending the shrubs. That gave way after an hour or so to bagging the debris, and that, in turn, to raking up the leaves and bagging them as well. I looked around, pleased with what I had accomplished. But I am a creature of habit, and not getting a shower in the morning is simply anathema. I had more to do, but I figured if I had to get another shower later, so be it. Around 10:30, I walked out into the backyard wearing a clean t-shirt and Bermudas, trying out my new summer sandals and examined my handiwork. I sighed. If only my marriage could be made to pass inspection with just the application of some good, honest effort. A voice interrupted my reverie. Jake, I heard the voice say from somewhere on my left. I looked in that general direction and noticed Melanie standing there, leaning over the fence. I waved in return. So, what's Mr. Industrious doing at home on a non-holiday like this? She asked cheerfully. I took a personal day off, I answered, not elaborating. Things to do, you know. Had breakfast yet? She asked. It struck me I had not, actually. I think I got so busy I just forgot, I replied a little sheepishly. I have some fresh coffee and croissants for brunch and I could sure use some company, she said, smiling enticingly. I thought for a moment. Okay, I replied and crossed through the two gates separating our yards. For the first time, I was able to take stock of her in a very informal setting. Laura and I had been in her house briefly when she first moved in, welcoming her to the neighborhood. She was always well-dressed, her home immaculate. This particular morning, she looked refreshed and put together, wearing shorts, flip-flops, and a t-shirt. She moved with an easy confidence as she stepped through the patio door to grab an extra coffee cup and saucer. Emerging a moment later, she gestured for me to sit. As I did, She placed a couple of hot croissants on a small plate in front of me, offering jam, honey, and butter. She waited for my choice. I declined them all, preferring plain bread, especially when it's fresh. We talked about this and that, how she was settling into the neighborhood, how she liked the town where she had lived before. She discussed the few brief years of happiness when she and her husband Ethan were married. After my Ethan passed on, she said, I had to get away from everything. I couldn't stay where we had lived. Why? I asked. My in-laws, she said crisply. They think I somehow arranged his death. He died of an aortic dissection. You understand what that is? I nodded. It's sort of like an aneurysm, quick, painless, usually a congenital defect if I recall my biology class. She smiled. Most people wouldn't have known that. I had this nasty habit in school, I replied. I studied. She laughed, a tinkly little sound. Anyway, I tried to remain part of the family, but they weren't having any of it. I think it chapped their butts when I was the beneficiary of his life insurance. I muttered, it's always about the money with some people. So, she continued, I pulled up stakes and here we are, you and me having brunch. You seem to have gotten over, well, the situation. I trailed off. Her smile never faltered. You mean I'm acting like some sort of merry widow? I nodded, and she continued, my Ethan was the love of my life. I loved that man with all my heart. And now he's gone. I mourned for him. I'm done. There's no contradiction. I feel no guilt whatsoever about it. I smiled to match hers. That's great to hear. So it was a happy marriage? She nodded. Far from perfect, but very happy. The only bone of contention, you should pardon the expression, was Ethan's sex drive. He was, not impotent, but he had a low libido. I, on the other hand, have a much higher drive. He tried his best to please me, and that was enough. Does that make any sense to you? I sighed. Yes, it actually does. My wife and I are, shall we say, at odds right now. Yeah, she said, I know about that. My eyebrows rose. Come again? She leaned forward on both elbows and said, Jake, I don't want to embarrass you, but your windows were open last night. Oh, I muttered. I'll bet the whole neighborhood heard us. She patted my hand, laughing lightly. I don't think so, she said soothingly. Your window, she pointed, opens on the side of my house. I could hear what was being said, but not completely clearly, and I was not inclined to eavesdrop. I doubt if anyone else heard anything. That took some of the initial sting out of it, but I kicked myself mentally. Damn. So tell me, she said, has she always been like this? I mean, thinking sex was a duty to be performed? I looked away, then back at her. I sighed heavily and said, yeah, pretty much. For reasons I didn't understand at the time, the story began to tumble out of me, the long engagement, the wedding night, the miscarriages. I talked nonstop for 10 minutes. She nodded sympathetically at key points, asking a couple of insightful questions along the way. Finally, I was done. I felt drained, liberated, like I had gone to confession for the first time in years. Melanie sat looking at me intently, smiling slightly, non-judgmentally. She abruptly changed the subject. So you're having a goof-off day to relieve your frustrations, are you? Yeah, I said. I can always find something that needs doing around the house. She began to clear the dishes. I grabbed some of them and followed her into the house. How'd you like to help me a little? She asked. I have some things that have gone untended, not having a man around and all. Somehow you don't strike me as being dependent on a man, I quipped. She giggled. Okay, that was sexist, she allowed. I mean another pair of hands, a strong back, a different perspective. Like that. Gotcha, I said. We loaded the dishes in the dishwasher and tidied the kitchen. Afterward, she said, I was sort of joking, but if you'd hang around, I'd really be grateful. Lead on, my lady, I replied. She grinned and led me to the attic entrance, the typical trapdoor in the hall ceiling. She explained there were some boxes in the attic, more like a crawl space, that contained items she needed, and some boxes she'd prepared downstairs that needed to be placed in the attic. I could see it wasn't going to be a terribly difficult job, unless attempted solo. We worked for about an hour. She brought boxes to me, which I carried upstairs, and I handed her boxes to take down. She was no stranger to hard work, matching my effort step for step. Though the day was cool, we both worked up a sweat. Eventually, we finished and took a break. We sat and drank cold water, catching our breath. By this time, it was afternoon, and she prepared cucumber sandwiches. We enjoyed the light meal, filling the time with small talk. We let lunch settle, then got back to work, attacking the garage with fervor equal to the mornings. By By 2:30 or so, we'd done quite a lot. Enough for one day, she declared. We retired to the comfort of her sitting room. She turned on the fan, it was too cool for the AC, and we sat in comfort for a few moments, the only sound the soft hum of the fan. I was sneaking surreptitious glances at her, noticing how the damp fabric of her t-shirt clung to her. Turned out I was not nearly as sly as I thought. She leaned forward in an exaggerated stretch, and in one quick motion, pulled the garment off. She sat there, grinning at me. After a moment, I said, Melanie? She maintained the grin. Caught you looking, huh? Don't worry, I won't tell. Besides, it's my house, and if I want to be comfortable, that's my business. I found my voice. Well, I can't say I don't appreciate the confidence. She stood, walked over to my seat, and plopped down in my lap, straddling my legs. She looked directly into my eyes for a moment before taking my face in her hands, leaning in close, and kissing me. It was intense and heartfelt without being overwhelming. Just a deep, meaningful kiss. After a few moments, she pulled back, still smiling. You know what? She said. I think we both feel a lot better if we freshened up, don't you? I looked up into her eyes, feeling slightly surreal, and nodded. She smiled, dismounted, and extended a hand, which I took. I stood, let her lead me down the hallway to the bathroom. She slipped off her shorts, then turned to disrobe me. She reached into a closet and retrieved bathcloths and towels. We stepped into the shower stall. She turned the water onto a nicely hot setting, and we began the very romantic process of washing one another. It was one of the most erotic events of my life. Laura had never consented to such a thing, much less initiated it. As I ran my hands over Melanie's soap-slick body and she leaned into my hands, I felt urges I had all but forgotten. I got on my knees and gently washed her. I believe she knew what would happen otherwise. Stepping out, drying ourselves and one another, we kissed our way into the bedroom. I picked her up and placed her on the bed, joining her as we resumed our kissing. After a moment, she whispered, "Wow." I rubbed her shoulder with my left hand and said, "Pretty good?" She nodded mutely. After a few more moments of silence, she said, "That's the best climax I've ever had. I'll bet you say that to all your lovers," I quipped. She moved her head back and turned to face me, a blank look on her face. I realized how that must have sounded and said, "Melanie, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that. I was trying to be humorous." She smiled. "It's okay," she said. She got serious again and continued, "I guess I've sort of given you the wrong impression of me." "Huh? No, Melanie. No, really," I said. Damn. I was just... She stopped me with a finger to my lips. "My Ethan never did that for me," she said. "He never really put in the effort. I've only ever been with 3 men before you, and only my college boyfriend ever made me feel truly cared for. He broke my heart. But then I met Ethan." She trailed off. She rested her head on my shoulder and, in a soft voice, said, "Can you just hold my hand for a moment?" I, of course, complied. Her grip was hesitant at first, but after a few seconds I felt her relax completely. She must have sensed it because she shifted closer, resting more of her weight against me. A warmth spread between us, a quiet understanding. After a moment, she looked up at me, her expression unreadable, before leaning in and pressing a gentle kiss to my cheek. An effortless gesture like something done 1,000 times before. I returned it, feeling a mix of emotions, relief, comfort, and a kind of happiness I hadn't felt in days. Eventually, she settled back, her head on my shoulder once more. We breathed in quiet rhythm for a few moments. A short time later, I said, "Melanie, may I ask you a question?" She raised her head fractionally, looking me in the eye with a wry grin. "At this point, I don't think there's much room for secrets between us." I chuckled and continued, "Why me? Why did you choose me as a lover? Am I reading way too much into all this?" She smiled and said, "Jake, I wanted you because you're a sweet, healthy, giving man who's been deprived. And I'm a healthy woman, likewise going without. You have a marriage that isn't feeding you. I had a marriage that didn't fulfill me. And I have the ability to bridge both our gaps." I looked at her for a time. "I could very easily fall in love with you," I declared simply. She shook her head. "Don't do that. Because I'll disappoint you. I won't fall in love with you. I won't break up a marriage." I started to protest, but she put a finger to my lips. "No," she said firmly. "I will not break up a marriage. I'll be here for you, tend to your sexual needs, let you attend to mine. No, I'll insist you attend to mine," she grinned, "but I will not interfere with your home life. Think of me as a vitamin supplement." I pondered her words. I had just been given a wonderful gift, To argue with her might put that gift in jeopardy, something I really did not want to do. At length, I just nodded and said, I can live with that. She smiled. Now it's getting late. You need to get home before wifey does. Without comment, I dismounted the bed, threw on my dirty clothes, gave Melanie one last passionate kiss, and left through the patio door. I made it into the house unobserved by any nosy neighbors, freshened up a bit, and dressed in casual clothing. I started dinner, which was nearing completion when Laura walked in. She made no move to greet me, and I reciprocated. She disappeared into the bedroom for a bit, then emerged freshened up and sat in her chair. After a while, she said, You didn't go to work today. It was less than an accusation, more than a mere statement. Nope, I replied. I worked my frustrations from last night. I emphasized the words. She bristled. Then I continued on the yard. I gestured with the spatula I was holding. She arose and looked out the back window. After a few moments of staring, she said, Looks good. I said nothing. For 10 minutes, silence. Then I announced, Dinner's ready. I'm not hungry, she replied, still sounding cold. Suit yourself, I said. I laid out 2 place settings, served myself, and ate in solitude. Then I tidied my place, put my dishes away, and went to my study. I slept alone again that night. The next day, I was alone again come morning, but I went through my routine, went to work feeling very, very good about myself, and returned home to an evening very much like the previous one. And so it was for several evenings to follow. Laura began to leave messages on the home phone, not to me, I noticed, but to the effect that she was working a little late and not to bother with dinner. When a little late began to stretch into a couple of hours, I called Melanie to see if her offer was genuine. Oh, it was. I began to look forward to Laura's voice messages. It allowed me to slip next door, enjoy an hour of Melanie's charms, and still get back before I absolutely had to. It took about 3 weeks before Laura had the audacity to ask whether it bothered me for her to be gone so much. Nope was my one-word reply. You used to complain about not having time together, she observed. Didn't accomplish anything, I said dryly. There was silence. Then, is everything okay? I looked at her and smiled broadly. Do what you want, Laura. I'm cool with it. She held my gaze but said nothing more. And so it went for the next few months. Laura worked late or was often away on weekends, claiming to visit her folks. During that time, I spent as much of it as I could with Melanie. Our connection was effortless, built on mutual understanding and companionship. In short, we were close confidants, deeply connected yet unattached in the traditional sense. And what a companion she was. Not only did she captivate me with her charm, but she also challenged and filled me intellectually, emotionally, and in other less readily definable ways. I felt so complete when I was with her. I fought to avoid falling in love, and it was a battle I wasn't sure I was going to win. The summer months gave way to autumn, and autumn to early winter. That led to a decrease in the frequency of my time with Melanie, what with Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's making unobserved trysts more difficult. Christmas was especially difficult. I wanted to be with the woman with whom I could not be in love, and had to spend it with the woman with whom I could never again be in love. Finally, the new year settled over us. End-of-year reviews led to promotions, raises, and recognition as valued employees. I attended Laura's promotion party and she mine, and we sat through each wishing we could be anywhere else. Several weeks later came the first of 2 tectonic shifts in our lives. On Valentine's Day, Laura called and told me she had to work late because her company, working as far out in the year as they did, had to meet regarding Labor Day or some such. I really didn't care. I used the opportunity to buy a red rose and present it to my fair Melanie. I knocked lightly on Melanie's patio door, as was my habit. I waited a bit and knocked again. Then a third time. Finally, I saw her moving toward the door, looking tentative, not her chipper self. Well, I thought. It had been 2 weeks since I'd been over. Maybe she'd gotten miffed. She opened the door and allowed me in, walking before me into the sitting room where she'd first presented herself topless to me all those months ago. She turned and I saw she'd been crying. At least, it appeared so. Her eyes were red. Melanie? I asked softly. Let me speak, Jake, she entreated. And please don't interrupt. Okay, I said. She nodded, gestured toward a chair. We sat and she started. I told you when our relationship began not to fall in love with me, remember? I nodded. Good advice, baby, she said. Good advice. She sniffled a couple of times, then continued. I didn't take my own advice. I waited. No sense rushing what I knew was coming. I fell in love with you, she admitted. You became my best friend, my lover, my focus in life. You're married, and I can't accept breaking up a marriage. She paused. I realized a couple of days ago, I need to ask you to disappear. From my bed. From my life. Fresh tears coursed down her cheeks. I regarded her for a moment. Then I stood, walked to where she was sitting. I placed the rose in her lap, bent down to kiss her cheek, and whispered, "I'll always love you." She bent her head and wept, and I silently exited her patio door, tears on my own face. I sighed in the February night air. That could have been the end of it. Remember I said there were 2 tectonic shifts? That was only the first. The second happened, I swear, on the Ides of March. It was a Sunday, a month after my separation from Melanie. I had gone to visit a friend in an adjacent state over a long weekend. Laura was almost always working, with no thought to me. We hadn't spoken more than a couple hundred words to one another since the blow-up the previous March, and those were mostly concerning work and weather. I arrived back home late in the afternoon, about 4:30 or so. I expected to find no one home. Imagine my surprise when I saw Laura's car there. Imagine my surprise when I saw Laura sitting on the sofa, obviously weeping, holding papers. My first thought was, oh shit. My second thought was interrupted by her turning to see me, fresh tears flushing out as she said, "We need to talk." I sat. She handed me papers. "I'm asking for a divorce," she said quietly. I looked at the papers. Divorce. Irreconcilable differences. I looked at her. She handed me another paper. As I perused it, she dropped a bomb. "I'm 4 months pregnant. A little more." That clarified everything. She wasn't divorcing me because of Melanie. She had cheated on me. For a long time. And she was pregnant, more pregnant than I had ever made her. I just looked at her. She shuddered a deep sigh and said it was right after that big fight last March. "Remember?" I nodded. She continued. "I hated you. I hated you for loving me. For being right about our, well, lack of sex. For impregnating me with your bad seed." Her face took on an evil cast with that last term. Then she continued. "You would have been a horrible father." She burst into tears. I recoiled involuntarily, unprepared for the vituperation she unloaded. She collected herself. "Then, I'm sorry. I blame you for my lost babies." I said nothing. "Again, for some reason I can't understand, I began to hate you," she continued. "I began to enjoy depriving you of sex. With each miscarriage, the impulse was harder. It was the only power I had over you to make you squirm. It's childish and even wicked, I know. I'm just admitting it." I couldn't even look at her at that point. "When you blew up at me," she said, "I knew you were right. I just didn't want you touching me anymore." She was silent for a moment, then went on. "Right about then, you stopped trying to make love with me. I was so upset because my only power over you was gone. Then, I started a friendship with a man named Brian at work. He was divorced. He had 2 kids whose mother had stolen them from him," she said. "He confided his problems to me, and I told him, well, I lied to him, sort of. I told him you hadn't touched me in months. After a moment's silence, I said rather dryly, well, that part was certainly true. But the damnedest thing, Jake, I wanted him. I wanted him to seduce me. I had the hots for him like I couldn't believe. You were a complete turnoff, and he was all I could think about." She looked ashamed. "So here we are," I finished. She nodded, looking wistful. So I continued. "What are you proposing with this?" I gestured with the divorce papers in front of me. "A clean break," she answered. "I'm moving in with Brian tonight. I'll get the rest of my stuff over the next week or 2. I can't really afford to let my half of the house just go. I'll buy you out," I offered. And from the look on her face, I knew that was what she had wanted to hear. She stood and walked into the bedroom. I sat and reflected on my good fortune. The sounds of her packing only accentuated my growing anticipation. I had to talk to Melanie. The sooner, the better. After an excruciating half-hour, Laura reappeared in the den, 2 suitcases rolling behind her. I stood. She looked at me. She made no move to hug me but said, "I guess I'll always wish things had been better between us." She turned to the door, then back to face me. "You want to know what the real irony is here?" I said nothing. "I didn't want to marry you. Nothing personal. I just wasn't ready to get married. My father pushed and finally I gave in. That time you stood up to him? The time you met? Remember?" I nodded. That was so impressive to me. It made me want to stand up to him and say, "No, I don't want to do this. But I thought you were so wonderful for doing it." She trailed off. I choked out a laugh. You live, you learn, was all I could say. She opened the door and left. I closed it behind her and felt the liberation I didn't know I could feel. I paced nervously for long after I heard her car depart. I wanted to run over to Melanie's house, take her in my arms, and proclaim undying love. I knew the process had to be more carefully planned, though. I forced myself to sit, to take stock of my situation, to consider all options. I could try to reignite with Melanie. I could also forget her, as if, and decamp to another city, pursuing a promotion I knew was available within my firm. Finally, I decided to sleep on it. I arose the next morning, having dreamt of scenarios all night, and attacked the day. Every corner of the day, every aspect of life, I pondered and thought and ruminated, and even spent a half hour talking to Ben about what was happening. Ben and I were good friends, but there was that boss-underling boundary I had never fully breached. Not until that day. I arrived home, convinced of my course of action. I made dinner, ate slowly, cleaned up, and made my way to Melanie's patio door. I knocked a few times, lightly, as she had come to expect of me. In a moment, she appeared around the corner. We locked eyes through the glass and the distance between us. And we both smiled. Hers, a hurt, reticent smile. Mine, a grin. She opened the sliding door and said, "Hi, Jake. It's good to see you. Could I come in, Melanie?" I asked. "I need to talk to you. It's really important." She hesitated for a split second before stepping aside. "Sure. Come on in." As I entered, I pulled her into a brief embrace. She responded, not fully, but enough to tell me what I needed to know. She took my hand and led me into the den, the same room where we had first met. Tonight, though, she was dressed more conservatively. We sat down, and she rested her hands in her lap, waiting silently. "Laura's pregnant," I stated flatly. Melanie's eyes misted over, her gaze turning distant. "I see," she said softly, looking away. Then suddenly, she snapped her head back, locking eyes with me. A couple of tears traced down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "But you haven't, the two of you?" She trailed off. I smiled. "That's right. Not for a long time." And here I pulled out the divorce papers. This is her request for a dissolution of our, well, not marriage, but social contract. Melanie's eyes lit up. More tears streamed down her cheeks. I crossed the short distance separating us. I knelt before her, took her hand, looked into her eyes, and said, "You told me you fell in love with me. Remember?" She nodded, barely able to breathe. "Well, I fell in love with you. With us. I want to be your lover. I want to explore our new horizons." Her eyes overflowed. I was afraid she'd send me away. But after a long moment, she nodded and whispered, "Yes, baby." She leaned over and hugged me. I stood, bringing her up with me, and said, "Let's go to my bed. Let's make love in my house." She smiled, tears still leaking, but looking decidedly less hurt. "No," she said. "Tonight, you sleep with me. In my bed. All night. You make love with me all night. What could I do?" I chuckled and nodded. The next morning, we both awoke refreshed from a peaceful night's sleep, long before dawn made its presence known. We shared a few tender moments, exchanged affectionate touches, and then made our way to the shower. When I kissed her goodbye for the day, I left feeling lighter than air. And so began my second marriage. There is no need to belabor the events of the next few months. I paid Laura enough to obtain her signature on a quitclaim deed to the house. She moved her personal effects out within 2 weeks, as promised. Melanie moved into my house, ultimately because it was larger, better able to accommodate our combined households. 3 days after the divorce decree was final, we married. I opted not to mention to Melanie that I had heard, through a grapevine to which I was still attached, that Laura had lost the baby. Seems it was not my seed. It was her womb. I mention it only because, as if to accentuate the fact, Melanie, on our wedding night, informed me I was to be a father. She told me only after some hemming and hawing. She admitted she had stopped taking the pill on the day after Laura's divorce request. She had hoped we'd get lucky. Well, we did. It's been 15 years now since that March argument. Melanie and I are parents 5 times over. Our children are loved and beloved, nurtured and educated, and consecrated to becoming the best people they can be. Melanie and I are still lovers. Of course, the demands of aging and children have taken a toll, but we still carve out some time to scrape one another off the ceiling. She still responds to my touch with heartfelt climaxes. I can report that with great satisfaction. And life just keeps getting better. Laura? She lost 2 more babies before Brian abandoned her. She lives with her parents, aging as they are. She lost her job. 2 more besides that. And lives at subsistence level, dealing with increasingly infirm elders. I almost feel sorry for her. Almost, and that's how one man's broken marriage led to a new beginning. Was he right in how he handled it? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.